this evening's keynote entitled Some Los Angeles Buildings by Jeff Kaplon. This is, what number is this? I think it's the fourth of this semester's ongoing series called the Berlage Keynotes, where we've invited a selection of speakers from different disciplinary perspectives and geographic, cultural, and political contexts to present how their work engages with contemporary issues and debates surrounding architecture. Jeff Kaplon is an architectural designer, founder, and principal of the newly formed Los Angeles-based studio Subtila. He was previously a co-founder of Part Office, an award-winning and interior design practice. He also helped start the Cactus Store, a multidisciplinary design and botanically minded collective working in publishing, architecture, and landscapes. He's also the founder of Subtilas, an architectural website started in 2009, focusing on the craft of contemporary built work. Jeff has studied in New Orleans, in Vienna, in Basel. He has worked in New York and New Orleans prior to moving to Los Angeles. Today's lecture, well, it was originally an invitation to show his work as Part Office, but now as the office is in this kind of he's in a kind of transitionary moment, it will be part to whole in another kind of way. So the stage is yours, Jeff. Thank you.
Hey everyone, can everyone hear me all right? Thank you, Solomon, for the introduction, and the Berlage for the invitation. I'm really humbled to be a part of a series that kind of also includes so many offices and practices that I admire. Also really nice for us to be here visiting the Netherlands, getting our week of seasons that we don't typically get in Los Angeles. It's nice to have the novelty of like your most rainy week for our visit. So I think as Solomon mentioned, the invitation comes at an interesting time when Part Office, which was a collaboration between myself and Kristin Korven, another designer that I used to work with professionally, and about 6 or 7 years ago, we just started this practice, Part Office. And up until recently, when we started to just become interested in slightly different methods of practice or different interests, allow ourselves the independence to explore things outside the purview of what that office represented. But the work that I'll be sharing today is a selection of projects from that time together that I think create a nice foundation of work that still has principles that are going to guide my new practice moving forwards. Today we're going to be looking at just a selection of 4 projects from our time in more practice or in more detail. Most of the work that we did were small in scale, lots of renovations, lots of interiors, very small additions, and even the detached structures were very small. But through these small projects, we kind of came up with a way of thinking and a sort of attitude and a position and interest through all these projects that sort of defined what the practice of Part Office was. And it sort of centers around what it means to work in the context in history of a built environment of Los Angeles that doesn't really appear to necessarily have one, or at least doesn't have an obvious one at first glance. And so it's kind of how we start to approach empathetically the sort of ambiguous architecture that makes up the vernacular of a lot of the city, and the process of discovery that we undertake to kind of find the potential in these anonymous structures. It's always been very important for us, and I think probably because we started with doing a lot of renovations, that the work that we do ends up being a part of the lineage in the places that we build. And it's through the kind of exploration of the typologies or the architectural elements or the materiality that we try to extract kind of deeper meaning into the buildings, and sort of resolve the conflict inherent in the projects when we're presented with them. So the title of this lecture, Some Los Angeles Buildings, let me see if I could do this right, is kind of borrowed from a book, an Ed Ruscha book from 1965, a photo series he did photographing apartment buildings across Los Angeles. And it's sort of an unceremonious and unremarkable title that I think reflects a similar type of building that's pretty prolific across the landscape of architecture, makes up a big part of the sort of post-war built landscape of the city. And I'll be looking at a lot of photography, a lot of photographers during this lecture, and the reason why is kind of twofold. One, it's an easy visual way to sort of describe the built landscape of the city for those who might not be familiar. And two, I think by looking at similar structures through the eyes of various artists, we can kind of start to extract sort of elements of interest from what are seemingly unremarkable structures at the onset. And I think that ultimately ends up being an approach that we follow in the way that we look at our designs. So the buildings that he was focusing on are a kind of series of small, mid-density apartment buildings. And he was actually interested less in the photos as art objects and more as a means of production towards the publication of his book. At this time in his practice, he was much more interested in publication, so these photos did not serve as fine art objects, but rather as kind of components in a catalog that he wished to make. But I think because of that attitude, what we were kind of left with is a very casual, almost dispassionate observer to these buildings, and presents a kind of perspective and a way of looking at the buildings that's really synonymous with how most of us in Los Angeles see these buildings. He was taking them from his car, stepping out of his cars, looking at them in intersections, and so there's a certain casualness to this, and the title of his book that I think speaks to a larger kind of environment that we encounter in Los Angeles. And I think, a very quick way to kind of understand these a little bit is within the context and history in which they were built. Rainer Banham, who wrote a book on the ecologies of Los Angeles, described them as Los Angeles trying to cope with an unprecedented appearance of residential densities too high to be subsumed within the illusions of homestead living, which I think is a really interesting way to kind of talk about LA's struggle to sort of densify in its post-war sort of expansion into a metropolis based on kind of principles that were pretty unique within the context of a lot of other American cities. And why they existed, like I mentioned, a lot of it kind of starting in the 40s, where the 350-mile basin of Los Angeles, contained by the mountains, the ocean, the deserts, the forests, started to be connected with the interstate, which ran parallel to a big population boom that followed the industrialization of a lot of the city. And so that kind of rapid expansion growth mixed with this newfound accessibility that the automobile presented, and of course our ideal weather conditions and relationship to nature, the kind of sunlight always setting over the ocean, I think painted the picture of LA at the time as a very ideal and futuristic city, and also did so with like a kind of certain casual nature, and one that presented a lot of independence in a way of the owners or the people that moved there. And these apartment buildings, the dingbats, are kind of a solution to this demand of the boom, where a lot of single-family lots were demolished in favor of these kind of 6 to 12 unit buildings, oftentimes where the owner lived in the unit as well, but all constructed incredibly cheaply with the most basic materials, kind of following a same typical zoning pattern, and only finding individuality through ornament and certain kind of applied design work. So This is another series from Judy Fiskin, who, in her photography, she was from Los Angeles, Ruche was not. She presented her photographs no bigger than a couple of inches square through the device that she used to take the pictures. And for her, this is a way of dealing with and assigning a certain nostalgia to these buildings, which I think is the kind of, unlike Ruche, who is dispassionate, this starts to show the buildings having a little bit of significance to memory, that they're mental, because a mental image for her was not sort of full of detail. And so to find detail, you have to focus in on the image. You have to look more closely. And I think that's something that, again, is something that becomes very important into our practice. Because when you stop to look at something that might feel cataloged in this way, so you're just kind of getting the commonalities of massing or form, looking at it more architecturally, I think, begins to elevate it. And this is Bevan Davies, who was photographing about a decade later, doing so in a very architectural style, medium format, treating these buildings with a certain level of reverence where the ornament becomes highlighted and the individuality of the structures becomes much more potent. And while we have never worked on this typology, the reason that I think I wanted to share it is just because it's a little bit more of a visual and an analog way of conveying a landscape, which feels also pretty appropriate for LA as like this almost billboard-centric city. And for me, also as someone that's not originally from Los Angeles, I've only lived there for about 10 years, originally from the East Coast of the US. It was a very confusing place to first try to understand the context or the reason for the existence of these buildings. And so I think through the eyes of these artists and the many others that have kind of worked here or have found interest in them, the highlighting this kind of general, non-specific and casual vernacular that speaks to the characteristics of the place and the variety of ways we can learn to appreciate it. And these photos from Grant Mudford also show a maybe similar approach as Davies, but beginning to look at it more industrial, commercial buildings, showing that this kind of combination of affordable, cheap, off-the-shelf building materials could also possess a similar potential for interest when they're captured or cropped or sequenced in a very particular way, which becomes another important facet of our practice, the idea of the common or standard material, the potential within them, the ways to refine them through juxtaposition, treatment, and relationships. And so that kind of leads into an early commission that we had in 2017 that we're calling the Fairfax Garage Conversion in the middle of Los Angeles. This was a project where we had to convert a former auto body shop into a mixed-use office and retail space. And the challenges that we were kind of presented with here was the typology of this as a kind of shopping center, and then the sort of various other types that are referenced from the industrial start of the garage, the commercial space of the building, and the residential adjacencies nearby. And quickly, these mini malls, through one more photo series through Catherine Opie, is the kind of, I think, commercial parallel to what we looked at with the dingbats. These mini malls, which she, in her words, calls bizarre, stupid, ugly structures that exist as a central meeting place in the community. The mall is all about how, in a huge, gigantic place like Los Angeles, we can still have the idea of the small shop owner. Similarly situated with the parking in front, kind of L-shaped buildings. They're easy to be overlooked, but they play a super important role to us in the city. It's often where the kind of like institutions or the staples of shopping or dining take place. But they also have this very horizontal, stretched out nature. And you'll notice in her photos, like all the other ones, none of them show pedestrians. I think is a deliberate choice, which of course speaks very clearly to the automobile culture in Los Angeles, where cars are really an extension of our private space. We leave from our cars or our houses, enter our cars, and kind of only end up at our destination. So that was a kind of consideration for us when we came to the site. Down below, you can see the two existing garage buildings that we actually had to maintain due to code restrictions. We had to kind of keep the building massing as it was to be granted parking access and signage. And here's the kind of product before, where we added a single story to one building and reclad the other. And, again, talking about the signification of like this building within the context where the red square is the building. Just north, you can kind of see the road east-west. There's a very robust, sort of actually pedestrian-friendly shopping district in that area on this street, Fairfax, that then by the time you get to our site is broken up into a 4-lane thoroughfare with a median in between. And so it's kind of, the desire was to expand this district up into where this site is. And so it was like the challenge of addressing the two states in which a user might view this building, one from the speed of a car, the privacy of a car, the other is the speed of a pedestrian walking up to the building. So how to see and experience this building from 35 miles to 2 miles an hour, and one that also kind of envelops all the typologies that I just spoke about. So, looking at the 2-story building, the ground floor more clearly references the existing auto body shop with a kind of metal siding that's spaced similarly to what was existing, retail windows that are large to allow for big displays, but also reference the garage doors. The level above, which was an office space for a record label, having a window arrangement that kind of reflects a little bit more the use on the interior, a siding that changes in scale, and windows that kind of, maybe like a little bit like the Fiskin thing, the kind of like loose memory of what we might perceive as a residential window, the kind of 4-light system that's slightly askewed to respond to the momentum of the asymmetrical roof, which is there to, reference the residential typology of the nearby buildings, but also to get your eye from the car to, be encouraged to kind of look towards the rear of the site where the other shops were. In the street front elevation, kind of similar to what I was talking about with the Mudford photos, who was looking at the composition of these kind of common elements, was sort of a strategy that we also had to take here, mostly due to budget and for zoning purposes, where the lower floor was already at the property line, so we couldn't clad it with anything, so we had to just refinish the stucco. The second floor set back just a matter of inches to be able to get the siding, and that the basic elements of the kind of gutter and skylights are there to kind of create a composition that sort of indicates the office above and the inner sort of courtyard feel of the retail on the other side. And here the kind of convergence of the two roof lines pointing towards the center of the site, where we had used to be a dumpster and now is a meeting place for the coffee shop. So taking what used to be the kind of least appealing aspect of the property, turning it into the largest public space. And the materials became super important for this project because, again, since we had certain restrictions with our budget, the jade color of this building is actually one of the factory defaults, like one of 5 colors that was available for this product. And while it was like a kind of function of the cost restriction of needing to find something that would work with our price per square foot, I think it started to show us that if we explored this very basic material, if we explored its application, if we used it monolithically or really studied its detail and its inherent properties, that we could perhaps add a lot of interest to it. Because as a material that is usually found in like big box stores or fast food chains or industrial buildings, we felt that it required a little bit of extra attention to be elevated to the point that would speak to the offices and the retail tenants. And so all of our details are exactly a 1/2 inch thick for all of our flashing and waterproofing, and that was to eliminate any hierarchy within the kind of standard weatherproofing that you might find with these materials, so that there's no difference between the roof flashing to the window flashings. And the building in the foreground is clad in a soffit panel, which is used for typically roof ventilation, the underside of roofs, but here we're using it as a way to kind of transparently reveal the existing cinder block building of one of the garages. And here showing how we've kind of, looked to the natural profile of this extruded aluminum as a way to inform our details. So starting the corner with one profile, mirroring it on the other side, So on the one hand, we feel like this kind of shows a respect to a very common material, but on the other hand, it really aided in the ease of construction and kind of started to formulate an early instance of us really examining these kind of common building materials and looking for their potential. And maybe here graphically, where just our lighting strategies come informed from the ventilation that were required for the doors. And in section, just wanted to point out that the building roof not only is there to kind of speak to some of the forms I mentioned, but also on the top section you can see to hide the mechanical equipment so it's not visible from the street. Same with the smaller building, the kind of mesh hides the HVAC units on the roof. And then at the rear of the site, this kind of little space to the right on the top was sort of a bonus space because at that wall is actually, we reached our limit of allowable square footage that we could build on this site, but we wanted to complete this building as a full object. And so we created an outdoor patio space that had the sort of minimum required amount of coverage to not be considered square footage, so it wouldn't kind of count against the area of the building that gives the owners this kind of bonus Terrell-esque cheap stucco kind of patio that they can enjoy the outside in. So going to be showing two residential projects that I think are built a lot on some of the lessons that we learned there. And this first one looks, you know, by going now to residential, we're kind of looking at that as a typology, which a lot of the projects that we've encountered for renovations have undergone the same level of development and the same type of proliferation as the sort of dingbats that we looked at originally. This first project was one located in Eagle Rock, which is a neighborhood in the northeast of Los Angeles, a kind of frozen in time neighborhood from the 40s and 50s, but proved to be a very difficult challenge for us. It was a building that the clients bought sight unseen. And when we went in, we felt a little helpless with how to kind of achieve the sort of programmatic and style goals that they wanted. But I think, again, it showed that, you know, with a kind of a lot of research and treating these buildings with a lot of respect, we were able to kind of discover a certain untapped potential that we didn't know was going to be there. And, you know, has a much greater and richer relationship to the landscape it sits on. This series by Joe Deal, I think, encapsulates, it's for a neighborhood called Diamond Bar, which is not where this house is, but a neighborhood about 20 miles away that sort of represents the exact same type of building, this sort of terraforming of suburban archetypes over a sort of incongruous landscape. His photos, I think what are interesting is he's always taking them from above, this kind of peering sort of observer. I think it sort of speaks a little bit to the geography of the place, but I think it eliminates a horizon line and shows these houses as individual objects that sort of neglect the overall context in which they're situated, and just the same as the development does. The only, you know, kind of moments of individualization you see starts to happen in these rear yards, either if it's through the kind of objects that they own, the curtains that they use, just very small hints. So again, this is kind of similar to our neighborhood. This is what it looked like only about 120 years ago, very pastoral and agricultural. And the site as it sits now, looking kind of straight at the San Bernardino Mountains, at the end of a sort of dead-end cul-de-sac, a little bit elevated. It's really a sort of quintessential example of this archetype. Here it is in the middle, with kind of some images and photos of the condition in which they bought it from the backyard. And so again, you know, the Deal photos or all these photos aren't really used as design references necessarily, but as a representation of the typology, so it helps us better understand our starting point for what these houses are and as a way to work with them. And so, you know, here is the kind of back facade that we ultimately came up with, and it's just the very subtle reorganization and sequencing of the same sort of suburban and nondescript elements that are found in the development of the houses. With this, we only did about a 50 square foot addition, which is found in the front, to create a kind of new collage that just feels a little bit more intentional, because now the windows are placed specifically to the interiors, to the use of the space. the kind of small clapboard details around the new window, reflective of the front facade, which you can see on the side. And also, it's a nice exercise for us in the kind of limitations of how far we can take this project, because with all these, we were dealing with relatively restrictive budgets, and so there's huge, or not huge, but like large moments that we weren't able to touch that maybe we wish we could, but we have to learn how to reconcile with. And so this front facade is, kind of virtually untouched except for just some finishes, but just has an inherently kind of deep entry, which is contrasted by what we did on the rear facade, where we kind of have a much thinner plastic sort of Hockney-esque idea of the kind of back of the house adjacent to the pool. And here's an image of the existing interior, which is where most of our conflict happened from. It's a house that was added on multiple times through many generations, very haphazardly and without any intent. It was a very visually cluttered and non-functional house, especially for this family, who was a gallerist and, in the art world, and someone who worked in branding, who was also a big chef, and their 2 kids. So they needed a much more open, kind of visually connected house, something that really connected the yards to the pool. A quick layout to just sort of show the bulk of the work being done on this ground floor. There's 2 floors of bedrooms above. So the idea was really about creating a diagonal relationship between these 2 spaces, the front yard and the backyard. Everything in red where we touched, black kind of existing walls that were kept. The kitchen was kind of flipped, and that was the window in the center of that kitchen that was visible from the exterior facade where it sits now, as a way to create a kind of bigger living room and dining room adjacent to the pool. The front living room becomes kind of a gallery space. And all this is centered around the core, which is a staircase, which was always the most intrusive visual element to sort of achieving all these goals that we had with the client. And so it was a really strangely organized staircase that kind of had several landings, half levels, but at the same time was the most important programmatic element that connects all aspects of the house. And so we really struggled with how to kind of cope with this. I think through a long process of trying to fight it or trying to hide it or trying to remove it in some way, what we ultimately came to once we started to extract elements of the stair is that we should actually be celebrating this. And, turning what, once became the most visually problematic thing into potentially the most sculptural and unique object in the house. So we started to really understand where all the risers and the runs came from. We started to build on it. We exaggerated it with kind of built-in and millwork, made sure that everything was kind of very visible so that the end result becomes this kind of loosely Escher-esque kind of play of staircases that don't really seem to have a reasonable start or stop. But I think becomes like a sort of design element within the center of the house that gives importance to this as the key way of moving throughout. Using kind of built-ins, as you can see, like that pole connects to a shoe shelf in the bottom, and the pole itself also is the one piece of steel in the whole house. We wanted to be very honest about the way in which we couldn't resolve all the structural conditions that we created by opening this up, and so the steel was just kind of left and powder-coated with a finish that mimics the raw primer of it. And it just sort of becomes one of several constellations of wooden objects throughout the house with all the new things that were done, given this kind of plywood treatment, so that there's a clear communication of acts that we kind of did as new parts of the renovation and leaving the rest of the house as sort of a backdrop to that. And here, I think, 2 views that sort of show how that diagonal view was achieved from the front yard with the plantings all the way to the back to the pool. On the landing, a little window that was added because that's at the level of the kids' room so that they could come over to it and see the family downstairs. And just one more structural kind of intervention that was done was the interest in raising the ceiling, which we didn't think was going to be possible through the budget restrictions. All of these houses are built very differently, even though they're the same type. And I think raising the ceiling is one of the first requests that we get on any house renovation we do. And it's always a different answer because it's always such a completely different structural system that doesn't always comply with our current earthquake codes. So this was a design that didn't really come to be until we started the demolition of the house and realized that there was enough shear strength in the wall shown on the left that we'd be able to open this space up completely. And there was this kind of existing semblance of a structural tree, which allowed us to kind of create these headers and posts that sort of form the new gable of the living room and the one over the stair. And again, kind of exposing these structures and almost kind of giving thanks to these like very standard construction beams because they offered us the opportunity to open up the space in the way we wanted. And kind of just 2 photos of the existing condition of that room and then sort of where we landed. Materially, just quickly, as I mentioned, the client was an artist, so there was this desire to have this kind of imported terrazzo stone floor, this kind of gallery-like flooring that also reflected a lot of the light and the color coming in from the pool, was active as a pool material. And to offset that, not only from a budget perspective, it's always the scales of where we decide to put the kind of resources into the project. And so it kind of started this also idea of like a mix of high and low. We're just using a marine grade plywood as a way to add some warmth to the house to sort of offset a little bit of the nobility of the material of the floor, but then the floor also in turn kind of elevating a little bit the material of the plywood, which we also treated with a certain amount of respect. We looked at over 50 sheets and kind of chose them as if they were marble, laid them out, and placed them really specifically with the client as a way to kind of make it feel designed. And the last image of the front living room, which kind of became the gallery space. The second house, which is really a sibling project to this one because it's also at the end of a cul-de-sac. We got the commission at the exact same time. It was the same budget. So there were a lot of circumstances that were similar. We actually photographed both projects on the same day, but a very different existing condition and client that sort of made us explore something a little different. So whereas Lock Haven was the exploration of maybe the spatial potentials, the structural potentials in these houses, this became an examination of the sort of domestic architectural elements that we find within these projects and the idea of kind of materiality within the housing market. So here the site, kind of see it at the end of a cul-de-sac in Mar Vista, which is a neighborhood much closer to the ocean, very flat. The house is the outside. Really no work on the exterior on this house at all. This was a house that the client had lived in for a while. She thought it would be temporary, but ultimately decided for it to be her forever house. And she owns a series of fashion stores in Los Angeles, so a lot of her life is filled with a great deal of color, and so she really wanted this house to be a much more toned down, subdued, almost blank palette. That was a very calm space in reaction to kind of where she spent most of her days. And so that kind of challenge of creating a white house was, I think, goes hand in hand to this kind of real estate boom that we're seeing in Los Angeles right now, whereas talking about the development that was happening in the 50s with the deal photos, we've had this second wave where the development is kind of coming in and flipping these houses, sort of coming in and just sort of washing them with plaster and sheetrock, removing any details that might be inherent in them, all in the name of kind of selling them as modern, kind of assigning a certain real estate value to that as a color. And so it became sort of important for us that for the task of finding a white house, which is so prolific, in the neighborhood now, that we don't have this house kind of feel that it's part of this trend, that its kind of design was the result of real estate opportunities, because it's kind of the way in which it was purchased originally. It had a similar method of renovation. And so our challenges here were just very basic spatially. Again, the desire to increase the volume of the space, slight reorganization of some of the things, but a problem that we found through the tight footprint is that the furniture, if anything, was kind of the thing that was providing a big block and making the space feel so compressed. And we also found, unlike Lock Haven with this project, that we were unable to raise the ceiling due to the structural conditions and mechanical equipment being on the roof. And so as a means to kind of try to resolve all these elements, the sort of, obstruction of the tightness of the space due to the obstruction of the furniture, the creation of volume, we actually decided to build down because the house exists on a raised foundation. And so cutting a hole in the floor and pouring a pit for the living room became it was actually a thing that the client suggested in one of the meetings, just sort of casually, because it was an element that existed a lot in this time period. Houses in the 50s, mid-century houses, Saarinen, and a lot like kind of using this as the social center of the house. But for us, I think we became more and more excited about it because it really solves so many of the pragmatic issues that we were concerned with. It gives the sense of volume. It kind of eliminates the presence of the back of the couch being the first thing you see when you go in, so that the client has a much more direct visual connection to the garden. And also, we placed a new skylight up there to kind of just exaggerate that kind of experience, so that when you're sitting within it, you're looking right up at the sky, looking out at the garden. And just that view from the outside, where all we did is really just repair the slider, because it has a certain profile and existence that you can't really do with current energy standards, but had a level of finesse that we were really into for this. And a quick diagram of just the area of renovation for this project. So the sort of pit and the idea of taking this couch and living room and converting it into a single cohesive design object was the inspiration to look at all the other objects of residential, sort of design, of kitchen design, through the same lens, and kind of forget what we knew about standards and typical constructions as a way to add a little bit more interest to the house. And especially to sort of make sure that we were looking at things that we typically overlook. And so, and then that factored in kind of with this interest in this single neutral tonal palette, and then the unique and uncommon perspective that we have with all of a sudden being in a portion of the house that's below grade, I think kind of brought opportunities for us to look at a lot of things that we normally wouldn't consider. A quick plan here, again, just showing that the majority of the work done in the house was really almost within a furnishings perspective when looked at in plan, a slight adjustment to the bedroom walls to the left to ensure, again, that there was a more direct link to the garden. And a view from the pit looking towards the kitchen. The baseboards were actually the first place that kind of came from the genesis of the pit, where we thought about this as like the most utilitarian object that just is a standard kick in the basis of kitchens. Now, because it's at eye level, again, should be like kind of celebrated and brought up and given the most special material that we used in the entire house with a sort of graphic marble. And then, the backsplash of the kitchen is actually a sort of custom concrete slab. So we were kind of inverting the typical way that the kitchens are done by, ground, counter, and floor, and inverting it because of the perspective of the pit. The vent hood of the stove, which we made round originally to make sure that visually it wasn't too obtrusive, but also wanted it to disappear into a skylight so it didn't have the same relationship to ceilings as typical ventilation. And all the materials here are designed and detailed completely flush, so there's no hierarchy within them. Everything is kind of completely flat, so that we've eliminated maybe one material being necessarily more important than another, even though we're using a wide variety. Looking back towards the pit, all the skylights are also clad in wood, painted wood, so that we kind of treat them as furnishings a little bit, and there's lighting within each skylight to make sure that they provide light at all times of the day and night. The entry, where we kind of also used graphic elements of marble to create a half wall, a tiny semblance of an entry sequence, just so that you're not looking into the side of the dining table, which is also where she worked, which we designed as well. The view towards the bedroom, where you can kind of start to see the light in the diagonal wall from there. The marble of a side table, because at floor level, given a little bit more of a ground material. And then stepping down into her bedroom, which is nice because it also steps down to the same level as the pit, the sort of bifurcated entrance to her bedroom through millwork and the bathroom with kind of two skylights that also have pendant lights. And each room here has an individual palette, a completely unique palette. There's over 25 shades and materials of whites, from different paints to woods, powder coats, concretes, composite stones, fabrics, stains, and washes. And it was a really interesting way for us to kind of find depth and detail within this sort of single wash of white, and to find how little nuances either in aggregate or grain or finish or materiality could say something maybe about the object that it's treated with or the room that it's in. And so while this, working parallel to Eagle Rock was interesting because it involved a much different nuanced approach, but I think in a similar vein of being really interested in maybe certain common elements or materials. And then the last project, am I running really long right now, or am I? All right. The last project is a completely different context and type of building, one that is not yet realized. It's in the process of permitting now and kind of on a potential permanent hold, but I still think good to show in the context of the rest of our work because it's sort of so dramatically different in the landscape and for the type of building. And the interesting challenge here is how we can draw on this idea and this interest in anonymous and ambiguous architecture that we do within the context of LA, but put it in a totally different context of the desert, where by virtue of the kind of extreme of that landscape, ambiguous objects inherently become sculptural. So it's us kind of combating a little bit with what it means to be ambiguous outside the sort of area that we were used to working in. Kind of hard to see, but this site was located in Joshua Tree, which is a town just north of a national park, about 2.5 hours east of Los Angeles, whose kind of presence is very much known within our city just with how it sort of drives our climate, but is a completely different world once you start to go out. This is the street leading to the client's lot where he had also lived for over 10 years, a very rural lot. The designation, the actual city designation is called rural homestead, where you're only allowed to build one structure for every 2.5 acres. His particular lot was 5 acres. And just a couple of images of objects around the site, I think just sort of showing how just the slightest semblance, the most kind of basic of kind of human elements start to become incredibly exaggerated when placed in this landscape. It's also a place, I think, where there has been a lot of experimentation, a lot of art, a lot of sculpture, because of the nature of the site out there. And the really kind of funny way that this sort of forced use of the vernacular of residential buildings that we're seeing in LA, like how the scale and the shape and the kind of presence of these become when all of a sudden placed within such a vast landscape. The last photos we'll look at, a local photographer named John DeVola from San Bernardino, who did a series on isolated houses studying this sort of effect and the influence of kind of sky, of color, of light, of day and scale. It's a place of such high contrast that the sun, the shadows, and the kind of tones that you get within a very monochromatic setting become very dramatic over time. And I think, most importantly, how, the most basic vernacular gestures become, as described, extremely exaggerated due to the kind of extreme conditions here. And this became a way for us to, better understand how the presence of a structure similarly sized would feel, how to approach even the form of the building, and kind of use that in combination with an interest in making sure that this building really acted from the inside out also as a new way to appreciate the desert. And a similar kind of real estate trapping of this area that guided the commission in the first place, with over the last decade that the owner lived in there, it's become a very popular tourist destination. And so the kind of Airbnb culture that's taken over, this used to really be his respite, this place where he could go out and kind of be in absolute solitude, kind of see complete darkness, no light pollution, no cars, no anything. And now his kind of house is surrounded by Airstream trailers and string lights and tourists and headlights. And so he wanted to create a structure for his creative practice, but also one so he could reinstill the kind of feeling of isolation and solitude that he was used to in his house. And here's a picture of his site. We were really interested in this, looking kind of at this mountain range. He's kind of directly in the middle of about a 100-mile valley that's flanked by 2 ranges of mountains on either side. And so, the consideration of these views, but also super important for it to be protected against the weather, just like some of the highest heats in California, but also extremely cold winters. And because of his presence on the valley floor, he has incredibly strong winds. So shelter is also a key importance here. And this painting, which I have not been able to find the author of, I've been looking for a while, but it's one of my favorite images for sort of describing the feeling of view in this landscape, because it's so vast and almost unobtainable that all it takes is kind of maybe the sort of idea of framing of the kind of domestic frame as a way to sort of inspire a little bit of a closer look at the detail. In the same way, we've talked about looking closely at the details and materials. I think with this desert, which might look like one continuous landscape at first glance, becomes a much more intriguing and much more texture and finesse and detail than previously thought. So here's the orientation of the building. You can see the existing house to the south. That small line to the north is actually a fence that the owner put up. There's a couple of different blockades that he's made as an early attempt to sort of block the view to other houses that existed on the site. And our project sort of exists directly in the middle with a kind of a circular cutout. Here's the sort of floor plan of how that exists. Another aspect of this that was really important was construction. This was a building that the client intended to build themselves mostly, except for the sort of concrete foundations. And so, again, also had a restrictive budget, had to be designed in a way that was very easy to construct and communicate the construction type. So it's kind of essentially built in 3 bars, 2 workspaces, one to the south that's a full height space without windows, but access to a central courtyard, which is also where the services are shared, and then a couple steps up into a sort of front, more residential working space, the kind of small section showing that. And I think stepping up was something that was really important to us also, because again, within the flatness and vastness of his site, the act of just moving up about 2 feet provides a dramatically different perspective of the landscape. And here, the kind of proposal that we gave, and where you can see that we were these sort of graphic residential elements that we were finding in these houses, the ideas of the gabled roof or the chimney. Here, we were re-looking at as methods to kind of create this art object in the middle of the desert. The gabled roof of the houses now serves as the truss that kind of supports the bottom level. The chimney stack actually is the kind of is a south-facing single window that allows for diffuse light into the workspace, since all the other windows are facing north, and for ventilation, air ventilation throughout the space. And it also, I think, a little bit of this arrangement kind of helped with this, like, blur a little bit the sort of programs that we're dealing with, where it becomes like this factory for creativity, a mix between industrial and residential that felt appropriate for the type of work that he's doing. And, again, like with Fairfax, this kind of monolithic approach to a single building material, to be able to be built by the client, who is certainly not a master builder or a contractor, but interested in construction. It's completely wrapped with a bituthene roofing material, so a kind of like almost liquid rolled out material that's then painted in an aluminum laced cool roof paint that helps with the climate control of the building, but also avoids completely any details needed at any of the corners of the building. So any transitions from roof to walls to flashing is eliminated. And because it's a little bit reflective, it starts to respond to the sky and the colors of the surrounding landscape. So as the sun moves and rises and sets throughout the day, the building will start to reflect that, which I think is most present in the courtyard, which has this sort of crescent moon shape that follows the path of the sun from where it rises to where it sets. And this space becomes, I think, really significant for him. It can either be an extension of the larger double height workspace, which when the garage doors open, allows this outdoor space to be a continuation of that room. Or, in later times when it's the winter, or if he wants more privacy and he can roll the doors shut, it becomes, again, his place of solitude, where he can be alone and watch the kind of movement of the sun throughout the day and the shapes it creates, the color as well as it paints the walls. And the roof plan just showing there's like this little ladder that's there, this railing that kind of connects and kind of completes that as a circle so that if he wants, he can go up to the roof and use it as a roof deck. So that's the kind of, the 4 projects that I wanted to look at in detail. There's obviously a lot of other things that we've investigated, but I think they're a little bit exemplary of how we kind of look at this ambiguity, either of architecture, of material, or of residential component, and applied them into a kind of variety or maybe the extremes of conditions that we've encountered. And so while I've probably gone through this with an obnoxious amount of detail, in some ways I think you could really single line summary each of these projects, like Fairfax, multiple typologies and multiple speeds, or the Eagle Rock House of spatial potential within unassuming construction, and Mar Vista, the reexamination of finishes and architectural components, or Joshua Tree, the creation of a new object, and dealing with these typologies in a disparate setting. And I'm going to do that super rapidly for a couple of other projects where this explored how to celebrate the conflict, our first commission, between existing conditions and new programs, how to assign a history for a house renovation that didn't have any discernible one. This, how to deal with an actual historically protected house and dealing with a kind of typology a little bit more with the sense of history as opposed to visually graphic history. How to renovate a house to become the backdrop for a significant garden, and within carve out an existing volume that was protected and couldn't be touched to preserve an envelope. This, a project we did in collaboration with Productora from Mexico, how to play off the profile of the existing roof of a house to better create interior and exterior relationships, or how to rethink the idea of an office space in a sort of, and working in a post-pandemic climate, especially when it's located right on the beach and coastal front of Venice, or how to design and build a retail space where the product is displayed in a manner much more consistent with how they're naturally found, or how when designing the same store on a vacant lot in New York almost becomes a temple-like gesture, or a more industrial one when placed adjacent to a warehouse that has certain circulation requirements that create the opportunity for a variety of spaces. Or currently one we're working on, how a structure in a remote and protected kind of wilderness can use the natural topography to inform its envelope and celebrate the use of shade as a refuge for both people and plants. Or another desert project, how this structure in the desert might address the idea of ambiguity through kind of a chameleon-like application of concrete blocks, which sort of serve as the building block for a lot of our construction industry. And so that kind of capping the time with part office, and I think serves as like a really nice foundation for the work I'm excited to continue with Subtila, which the meaning comes from a little bit of the architectural website. Solomon mentioned Subtilitas, which was a blog that I started dealing with the kind of details and the technique of built work, the kind of refinement of the craft of built work, but with that word shortened to the sort of prefix of subti, which meaning subtle, and kind of given the postscript of LA, rooting it in Los Angeles to kind of continue exploring this ambiguity in the city. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for your lecture. So I want to ask you, what do you think is the connection between your architecture projects and the projects that you choose to upload in the Sublimitas website?
It's a really good question. I think there's it's intentionally a little bit different. I think it's a kind of resource that I tend to stay away from when we design new work, because I think it's really easy to be influenced by the kind of visual characters of the building. And I think that's something, I started that website in 2009, which was a time that was a little bit before Instagram and Pinterest and these kind of single image-based ways of looking at buildings. And it was started at a time when it was like during our first sort of big recession, or not first big recession, but a recession in the US that happened around 2009, where there was really no architectural jobs, and my only way to find some inspiration in the field. And so I think it just continues to be that way, as like a sort of publishing method of discovery, and just following my interest and excitement of discovering young offices and built work that I really respect. But I don't think necessarily it has a direct correlation to the projects that we do, outside of maybe it being, you know, kind of a big foundation of education and knowledge, and kind of like looking to, you know, because with each project I post, it's not just the image, it's me understanding each building and understanding the sort of ways in which it came to be. And so maybe it's more of just a bigger knowledge of ideas and strategies and ways of approaching. But I try to keep it, you know, despite the name, I think the name connection here felt a little bit more appropriate, since Subtil is a more personal project. Part Office was a very collaborative authorship between Kristin and myself, that this kind of relates a little bit more maybe just to that interest of craft and understanding construction. But we're tailoring it a little bit more towards, you know, American building standards, which are a little bit more serialized, and the result of, you know, a lot of different factors. Very litigious society, expenses, the kind of individualization of all the trades. So, yeah, I think that's, if that came close to answering it.
Yeah. Hi, thank you for your lecture. So, because a lot of your work is focused on photography, and a lot of the projects you have shown, you show a lot of stage photography. I'm guessing before the building was actually occupied, so just as it was finished. I'm curious as to if you have ever thought about documenting post-occupation, and if that has influenced your work in any way, or?
No, that's a really good question. I think it's probably one that a lot of architects deal with when their project's complete. I'd say sometimes it's a kind of matter of circumstance more than a matter of choice, of just sort of completing a project, being able to work with a photographer at the right time. But of course, you know, I think we're interested in showcasing the most clearly, like the architectural elements in the design, without potentially having choices that were done by others maybe take away a little bit of what that informs. But at the same time, you know, all these houses exist successfully once they're moved in. You know, so especially like on the house that was the sort of Mar Vista house, which was an all-white house, a big portion of that being all white was also so that it could serve as a neutral backdrop for the owner, who had a large collection of art and colorful fabrics and kind of all the things. The green bench that was visible in that photos was a fabric that she chose, the kind of start of like her insertion of the color into the space. But I think, you know, there are other projects that, you know, were shown at the very end that weren't kind of showcased here, in which we've also designed a lot of the furniture for, that there's been a little bit more holistic approach to the buildings. Other projects that, like that house that I briefly touched on, the House Without a History, where it was for clients that own tens of thousands of books and records and run a film series. And so the main material of that house becomes the objects. And so I think it's just a little bit of a case-by-case basis. Like with each of these projects, we've also had press afterwards that kind of follows a little bit more of the clients and their personality, and they're re-photographed with them in their home. So there's kind of two facets of it. I think for me, just sharing for an architectural school or for a lecture showcasing the architecture and the design of the work, interested in a little bit more making sure that that's super clear and maybe not sort of muddled at all by objects that maybe weren't part of our consideration. But that doesn't mean that we are like, you know, there can be nothing in this house for it to exist how we want it to be. It's like we're you know, they're all the backdrops for that type of life that needs to happen. And that's, you know, the most like gratifying is coming back to a project after a few months and seeing it get a little messed up, scuffed up, seeing how the kids run around, seeing where they pin things up, seeing the furniture and how they decide to move things around. So, but it's a good question. definitely something to kind of keep in mind for future projects.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for the lecture as well. I think I really appreciated especially the reflections on the past, on nostalgia, and looking at LA and a lot of the photographs that you shown. And then you also were looking at some current trends of Airbnbs, of Pinterest, et cetera. I'm wondering, how does the future, if that's the future of nostalgia, of LA, how does that influence your work and your practice?
It's a good question. Because I think I said the line that we're always interested in the work being a part of the lineage, and I think maybe because we're so interested in a somewhat ambiguous and unremarkable architecture, that I think we hope that maybe the kind of insertions that we make into these buildings, or the way in which we adjust them or add on to them or intervene in them, kind of assume a similar role that can be that same backdrop for whatever happens to that house in the future. Like the Eagle Rock house just last year was sold by those clients, and so it's sort of like already taking on something that we felt was so personally tailored to them as a family. And we're really kind of a little bit like, well, how are you going to sell this? Or just going to rip out that weird plywood staircase or do this or do that? But just ended up being another family that kind of was interested in sort of the objects that we created. And with that, they found their own kind of inherent real estate value that we were happy that the clients kind of were able to get back when it was sold. So I don't know necessarily, I don't think there's like an explicit consideration of where these things might exist in the future. I mean, we obviously try to design in detail and build well and kind of robustly and make an architecture that's going to be durable and last through the lives of the family, but they're still in these somewhat temporal structures that are just stick framed and, you know, built in the 50s and never initially meant to last probably more than, you know, the age that they are. So yeah, I don't think there's much sort of in the way of like a consideration beyond the kind of immediacy of how things are going to age. You know, the Fairfax building that we finished in 2017, I just went back to a couple weeks ago. Juan visited when he was in LA a few years ago, and I've been happy to sort of see that building, through multiple tenants and ways of people moving in, all the original tenants are gone now, but it's still a building that kind of, we were lucky to have detailed well, so it looks still kind of similar to how it was, but has just taken on a little bit of a new life, and maybe if it kind of further gets converted back into a garage, it can be a proper shell to do so.
Thank you very much. I found it very fascinating that you use the idea of ambiguous architecture as a driver behind your previous practice and probably your future work. Also because in architecture school, when something is referred to as ambiguous, maybe when you start architecture school, you consider it as lame or something half done. I'd like to hear more about how you and your partner, Kristin, decided on this as like a way of phrasing your firm and your work, and how you also portray that to a client.
Yeah, I think, well, I think it sort of, you know, going all the way back to maybe some of the first stuff and looking at Los Angeles, again, as someone who wasn't from there, I think it took me a while to understand the context of Los Angeles, because it is a very unambiguous city, or ambiguous city. You know, the kind of, these mini malls and these objects, all things that kind of, in my experience, I associated with the sort of far reaches of suburban things far away from the city center, existing in the kind of middle of a metropolis, was really confusing. And I think something that at first glance would be really easy to sort of dismiss as kind of unremarkable. But I think, you know, Kristin, you know, again, as someone who's from there, I think it was really instrumental, like her, you know, kind of educating me on the importance of that as nostalgia. As someone who grew up there and kind of lived in these objects, shopped in those places with their family, they have a much more significant meaning than it might to me. And so I think it just sort of showed us that it's important to kind of give all of these objects respect when we first look at them, because if in doing so, it helps show what they could kind of reveal, or yeah, it helps kind of show, you know, the sort of masked potential within it. And then I think there's a second side of it that was really pragmatic in the beginning. When you get your first commissions, you know, we weren't kind of awarded like a giant endless budget project. We had all these, you know, all these projects were super restrictive budgets. They were small things for Even the Fairfax thing was a kind of very small development that had all these restrictions, either code or monetarily, and so you are forced to kind of confront the banality of the existing conditions or the context around it by just these kind of technical and pragmatic restrictions. And then as we got further and further into it, I think it developed more from being like a hindrance to an opportunity in each one of the projects, and something that I'm still the kind of, it's the most exciting when you kind of find that moment that you're desperately searching for in the project, when something just sort of seems impossible to kind of resolve, like with the Lock Haven house, of just going through the existing photos, like being in that space for weeks and having no idea how to do it, and then just kind of finding that one sort of thing that sort of indicates to you what it could be is still kind of the most exciting, and why now I think even pragmatics aside becomes something that I'm interested in continuing to pursue.
Hi, thanks for the lecture. I was wondering, for like the series of very satisfying photos you've shown, and thanks for showing the kind of power of photography to flip these banalities, like you just said, like these very common normal things, flip the meaning of this. And it's really nice to see how you do that architecturally as well. I was wondering how, are there more ways or other ways that photography has an influence on your architecture? For example, I could, or you were saying something about the lowered seating area, how from that perspective, suddenly the boarding became very important. I could imagine maybe you already see the photograph, or maybe you actually design in this kind of perspective already. Could you tell a bit about that?
Yeah, I think, I don't remember if I mentioned it or not at the beginning, but I think, the photography, again, it's not, and I'm not saying you're suggesting this, but for us, it's not a sort of method of design influence for us. I think it's almost like it's something that, I personally also was kind of retroactively using as a tool to kind of try and better understand the context of our projects within the scape, particularly for a lecture, as a way to sort of describe and sort of, contextualize them in the place. But I think that, the use of photography, and maybe this actually speaks more to kind of the website and that as an image-based platform. I think there's certainly like a very analog way of seeing in both those instances that really resonates with me. And I think Los Angeles is inherently a very analog city. It's very visually based. It's all about kind of like this incredibly long, drawn out, stretched out series of like little nodes masking itself as a city. And anything getting kind of attention within that, it does so with this sort of visual like, reach, it kind of raising its hand, trying through a billboard-like architecture. And so, I think there's like two sides to that. There's like, the moment in a house where you're like, oh, this is going to be a good photo. And then there's also kind of being surprised when the photographer gets there of even seeing a kind of influence. Like the photographer that we used for those two projects, this woman, Naho Kubota from New York, we chose her specifically because I think we found that she had a really interesting way at looking at details from some of the other projects that she photographed and some of the art that she photographed. And there was a certain level of us wanting certain shots, and then us just sort of letting her kind of show us things that she sees that exist within the building in our design, but might be framed in a way that we didn't even realize that were there. So, certain moments like in that house, like, yes, definitely thinking about the kind of eye, the experience of the user, maybe through a frame, but maybe some of it is even just a little accidental or a pleasant kind of surprise at the end. If that answers that.
Yeah, no, thanks.
Okay, cool.
Thank you for your lecture. I guess I have a bit of a question following the past two questions in a way. Mm-hmm. You talk about the work as being inspired by LA, mm-hmm. but you also talk about ambiguous and serial architecture being very characteristic of the States. Mm-hmm. I'm sort of curious, in my own reflection, that in some ways the architecture that you presented tonight could be in any city, and it might feel like it fits in. Mm-hmm. So I guess, where's that line for you in the work between when it is no longer characteristically LA, because there is such a rich lineage in many ways with California architecture, at least. Like at what point does it no longer become LA architecture for you, and at what point could you imagine that one of these houses gets plopped into Georgia or North Dakota and it still, fits in a way?
Yeah, I think what maybe the importance of LA, and again for me, is like kind of like I still feel like a naive visitor to the city in a lot of ways because it's so massive and diverse that it's always kind of revealing itself to me whenever I go out exploring. And so I think it's more that the city has sort of kind of taught me some of the lessons that I described in this, because even within Los Angeles, I kind of exemplified it with maybe a suburban cul-de-sac house or a certain typology, but a lot of the projects that were flashed at the end, I think, to us, there was never really a stylistic through line in any of our work. We were never starting any project with any interest in how it should look. It was always kind of a method of research and understanding the context and whether it's an existing condition or a vacant space that is going to have a new building, that, the first parts of our design were always this kind of conversational research aspect where we're kind of looking into histories and landscapes and surroundings before we get to, anywhere near our first sketch. Is usually after we've found a way to kind of talk about our building that makes sense to us. And so I think that's the lesson that, or the kind of way of practicing that LA taught for me is part office being the kind of first time going out onto my own with Kristin. And so I think it would just sort of be a similar attitude or approach to context and site, because within LA you can find such a variety. There's so many architecturally significant things there. There's this kind of birthplace of American, well, maybe not birthplace, but a proliferation of modernism out there with Eames and Neutra, Schindler, Lautner. There's the kind of Frank Lloyd Wright influence. There's the invention of the craftsman style. There's the bungalow. There's like so many. LA in itself is hundreds of little cities and influences from all parts of the world. And so it gives you an immense amount of variety to kind of experiment with it. But I think it's also, the casualness of the city is what is sort of in the kind of weather, and just all of it, I think, feels very, I don't know. It's just something about the kind of spirit of the place is what sort of encouraged us to kind of look at what we would consider banal and I think unremarkable is probably a better word, but I feel like I'm just kind of going in circles with this now. But I think more importantly, just a sympathy to site and a sympathy to existing conditions, and not knowing what something's going to look like in Georgia, having no idea what the desert project was going to look like until we were kind of well down the line with this sort of conversational understanding of what it meant to build in that place.
Hello. I'm very intrigued because I think throughout the your lecture and also our questions, there's this really interesting tension between you as an outsider who've never lived in LA until you start practicing there. That's how I understood it. Mm-hmm. And by having like a lot of practice that's exclusively there, and this lecturer really focusing in LA. And I wonder, like, through your practice and also living there, do you internalize that sense of nostalgia in a sense that you mentioned in maybe what Kristin, your partner's mentioning? Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's sort of been like the gradual understanding and appreciation of the things that I kind of really dismissed at first go. And I think why I preface that is because I don't kind of see myself in any means as like an expert on the city or even necessarily how to build in the city. And I think that naiveness also allows us, or allows me, in the course creative collaboration with her, to kind of be able to look at the buildings that we work in with maybe slightly uninformed eyes as a way to kind of accept them. Because I think when you, or when we might go to a structure and already have certain assumptions about it, it might preclude us from being able to kind of fully realize what opportunities might lie within it, if that makes sense. And so, I'm sorry, what was the second part of your question about, like, kind of internalizing it?
The nostalgia?
Yeah, and so it's like, you know, I'm kind of making my own as time goes, you know, with kind of every project that we do. It's like, you know, I don't have childhood memories in here. You know, I moved here as like a little later in life. And so that nostalgia, though, is something that is kind of, you know, really becomes more and more baked into you the longer that you're there. And of course, the more projects that we work on, the more variety, the more clients that we meet. You know, we're super compassionate with our relationship with our clients. It's like a very collaborative conversation, and to meet someone where you kind of feel how important this project is to them, whether it's someone that's kind of from there, kind of putting all your faith in as a designer, it sort of really encourages us to kind of resonate with that nostalgia, that kind of feeling importance that they have. And, you know, LA is also like a very strange, timeless place. When there's no seasons, the passage of the years becomes really abstract. It's a lot different from the kind of clear demarcation of the years of start and stop. So it's like sometimes I feel like I've been in LA for like 4 years, but it's actually been 12. And I previously lived in New York, and 4 years there feels like 15. And so it's like a very just different type of way of getting to learn and experience and know a city that's, I think, filled with like a certain curiosity, which maybe then ties to a certain level of like nostalgia, of like just, you know, perpetual interest in learning more, and excitement about kind of discovering and creating within it. Yeah.
I have a question, but I'll ask at dinner. Nostalgia. No, but maybe I'll just ask it now. So I find it interesting because, let's say, LA exists in a kind of younger generation of architects. The contemporary, well, let's say your generation, well, I guess my generation too, but I take myself outside of it, where the use of Rouchet, of Hackney, of, let's say, this kind of, the banalities of, let's say, everyday life in LA is a kind of cultural discussion, or it is a kind of, it is in the discourse of architecture, just atmospherically, and maybe we could say that there, yeah, is a nostalgia in that. And I guess I would just like to see where, considering all your the different fragments of offices, I put that in quotes, that you have, or the different sets of interests in how you establish your own discourse, how you relate to that kind of contemporary moment, let's say, of, let's say, being part of a kind of contemporary discourse about LA. Like, I mean, I'm just thinking, you know, we've seen all Big Splash, an iteration of Big Splash in many architectural images, photographs, renderings, etc., as one example, right? And I mean, once I will trace that in an essay, but you know, where do you place yourself that in that making of images, right, of what we see, and how do you feel that, you know, is there a need or a nostalgia to place yourself within that contemporary debate in order to kind of, let's say, propel a practice or propel a career, you know, to be, yeah, a bit blunt, right?
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, because there's kind of two sides of it, and just to sort of speak on nostalgia really quickly, I think again, I think the reason why I was very interested in it, just as a concept and a term, is because I think it just was the first instance, you know, going all the way back to the Fiskin photos, of a way of assigning a certain value to an object that might not have that same value to anyone else on first glance. And so the kind of the early stages of me sort of starting to understand a certain meaning to the built context and landscape of the city. And, you know, I think there's quite a few younger offices of my age kind of popping up in LA, either ones that are kind of starting to branch off from some of the bigger practices that have existed there, or kind of moving here from outside. And I think, you know, a lot of younger offices are also dealing with similar sized commissions and the same sort of challenges that we are. And so I think that I don't know, this might be like kind of a cop-out on your question, but I think because sometimes when we're working, we're just so a little bit in a vacuum, honestly, of the individuality of the project and being very conscious not to be super influenced by potentially what that conversation becomes. Or outside influences, as I mentioned with my blog, it's always like a really concentrated effort to kind of not use that as a design tool, because I think it would be too easy to become derivative just from an aesthetic perspective and kind of lose the chance to have a conversation that would make the projects a little bit more meaningful. But I think what's interesting maybe about some of the younger practices that we're colleagues with is that there's kind of similar explorations happening without maybe, kind of collaborative intention, that there's kind of, an interest in, again, I don't know if it's a pragmatic one of kind of starting with smaller commissions or a city that's, kind of filled out and not a lot of room for larger kind of new scale constructions, at least within the friends that I have that are working there. And so we're all kind of trying to address these conditions and these existing conditions in the same way. I'm not sure, to be totally honest, like how that might kind of speak to a larger dialogue of the city or what kind of propels our practice. I feel like because, with what we did with Part Office and what I hope to do with Subtilitas is just sort of every project as it comes and every challenge as it comes a little bit each new commission that it comes sort of really being hyper-focused on it and not always thinking about it within the sort of larger kind of portfolio of the practice. I don't know if that's kind of skirting around your question at all, or if that...
But that starts to get to a clear position.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.